So what we're going to be looking at tonight is based upon our traditional understanding of the book of Revelation, that the book of Revelation is full of symbols, but those symbols unfold down through time, so that it doesn't matter what age a brother or sister lived, they will be able to see where they were in God's prophetic scheme of things. And we call this the continuous historic understanding of the book of Revelation. And one of the important things that does is to give us a clear understanding of the position of the Roman Catholic Church, how Jesus regarded this system of iniquity that was to develop, and it alerts us we should look with the same eyes at this system. And so this is one of the wonders of our traditional understanding of the book of Revelation. We see that the book of Revelation complements the Old Testament. The Old Testament, in the main, is dealing with prophecies that look at the nation of Israel and things that happen to the nation of Israel, whereas the book of Revelation, in the main, is looking at events from the viewpoint of the ecclesias and things that were going to happen to the brothers and sisters of Christ down through the ages until the Lord Jesus came back, and indeed gives us details of events at his return, and shows the opposition that they would have from corrupt Christianity. Now this contrasts with, I'll put new in inverted commas, because the new ideas which do circulate in our brotherhood aren't new ideas at all. They go back to the Middle Ages. They were put forward by the Roman Church to mask people understanding what the book of Revelation was saying about them. But there's much spiritualizing of Old Testament prophecies, and the book of Revelation is either said to all be fulfilled by AD 70, or at least by the time we come to Constantine, or it's nearly all relates to the future, to some 3.5-year period, Great Tribulation, and all that is described in Revelation fits into a slot way in the future. We can illustrate the difference, it's called the preterist and the futurist, the titles there. But if we just put a timeline and we put AD 1 and put where we are today, and just put some dates there, AD 70 and Constantine there and the French Revolution, then it's either the book of Revelation fits in this time period here, say up to the time of Constantine, and then nothing for long ages, or that it all fits in at this still future date, and for 2,000 years there was no unfolding for brothers and sisters to understand where they were. Whereas our traditional understanding, as Brother Thomas set forward, the continuous historic, that in fact the book of Revelation unfolds down through that time period, so that all ages were covered by Revelation. But the important difference between our traditional understanding and these newer ideas, especially the futurist ideas, is the timing of Christ's return. Our traditional understanding is that the Lord Jesus, his coming back is the first event. It is the resurrection and the judgment that is so imminent. And that's going to take place before Israel is invaded, the Gogian invasion. Whereas these more modern ideas have it that the resurrection and the judgment is after Jesus has returned and saved the Jews. And one can see immediately that it puts us in a difficult position. If we are expecting Jesus not to come until we have seen Israel invaded, then if the traditional understanding is correct, that Jesus comes first, that's the first event, then we will be caught out. And it is, or say, around our traditional understanding that the first event will be the return of the Master and our call to judgment before ever Israel is going to be besieged. So that's the framework we're going to use. I'm just going to give a very brief summary of the sequence of events as I see it. When we get to the end of the second half, I'll give a much fuller account, and I have got handouts of those for you. But just to give us some concept of where I'm going. This, I believe, is the scriptural understanding of what will happen. But first of all, the return of the master to the household, what we call the judgment seat. And during that period, which I believe will take some considerable period of time, there's the final preparation of Israel, nations gathering and preparation for Israel to withstand that invasion in part. Then there follows the invasion. The armies of Europe and other nations come and invade Israel, take Israel captive, destroy Israel as a nation, and in their extremity they cry to God for salvation, and saints and Christ are prepared there, and they come and they save Israel, and that is the Battle of Armageddon, the saving of Israel from the hands of their enemies. So Israel is saved and Gog is destroyed, and step by step the nations are brought to submit, and Europe will feel the judgments of God for their persecution down through the centuries of God's people, both the saints and the Jews. And finally, step by step, the kingdom will extend until Christ reigns over all the earth. Now, what I wanted to do is to look first of all at the key players, especially some of the events which have just taken place in the past month. Now, the book of Revelation, if we would just turn to Revelation chapter 16, we could have had it as a reading. Revelation 16 details the situation as it will be at the time of the return of the Lord Jesus. And it presents before us three players on the stage. In verse 13, it describes a dragon and it describes a beast. Now, these are symbols which have appeared earlier in Revelation in chapter 13 and chapter 12, in fact, the dragon. And they have gone through various phases over time. But this is the painting, the symbology of the situation just prior to the return of the Lord Jesus. There is a dragon, there is a beast, but there is a new symbol introduced which we haven't come across before, and that's a false prophet. Now, if anybody's got a better picture of a false prophet, it's very difficult to depict a false prophet, but that's my depiction of, well, some artist's depiction of a false prophet. So there is a false prophet, a very apt symbol, we believe, for the Roman Catholic Church in its present dispensation, when it has been shorn of its power and its lands, and it is building itself up at the moment, trying to regain the position that she had in past centuries. But those are the three powers that we're told to look for in Europe. The dragon we associate with Russia, the beast with Europe, and the false prophet with the papacy. But when we turn over the page to chapter 17 of Revelation, the situation just slightly changes. Instead of having a false prophet and a beast, we're presented with a woman riding the beast. So the false prophet has, as it were, changed slightly in her symbology and is sitting upon the beast of Europe and riding her. In other words, in control of Europe. And we know that this is the situation right at the end, because in verses 12 to 14 it describes how this is the situation. The beast makes war with the lamb, but the lamb overcomes them. So quite clearly this is the end situation. We have a woman, the church, strong, dominant, controlling Europe as it had done in past ages. And this is what is so interesting, brothers and sisters, to see today. We have the emergence of the dragon power, Russia, becoming strong again. We have Europe, especially Germany, emerging. Germany is establishing herself as the leader of the EU. And we have the papacy working under Benedict and under his predecessor, working very hard to reinstate Catholicism at the heart of Europe. And so successful is Benedict especially, that the humanists are truly worried. They cry out and protest at how Europe is being influenced by the Vatican, that Europe is becoming under the control of the papacy. Now, the Pope has worked, and this really isn't our subject, but just of interest, but it is so interesting. It's just recently, last week, been in France, encouraging the people, saying, if we put the church back in the heart of politics, then we will be able to withstand this Muslim invasion, which of course Europe is so afraid of. And interestingly, only yesterday, I downloaded an interesting article all about, it was in a magazine from Italy, an independent think tank, but it was headed the Pope of the West. And it described how the papacy had lost all its power, but now in the past 30, 40 years, step by step, it has been increasing her power. And the power of the church is really being felt, and we shall see this accelerate as people turn back after half a century of secularism, turn back to Catholicism as their roots. So that's the final step with the woman riding the beast. If we put faces against the dragon, the beast and the false prophet, these are the ones. They can change. We just had a change in Russia. There are new elections in Germany next year, but it's the countries, it's the powers behind the faces. And as I say, it has been so fascinating in the past month to see the bear awaking, and we shall look at that in a moment. And we saw how it was Germany, working with France, it was Germany who made sure that no sanctions were taken against Russia, because Germany is working hand in hand with Russia. As I say, just the last week, we've seen some of the wonderful inverted commas speeches that the Pope made when he was in France, encouraging the laity to proclaim, use their influence in their work in everyday situations to promote the church in Europe. We read together from Ezekiel chapter 38. And here is another picture. Revelation has talked about beasts and that. Ezekiel chapter 38, let's just turn to it, paints nations by describing them under the terminology of nations which were known in the days of Ezekiel, and we have to trace them out. And just very briefly, because I don't want to take a lot of time on this, but there are 9 nations listed there, using more modern translations, which instead of chief has Rosh as a proper name, rather than an adjective, is it? So 9 countries mentioned there in Ezekiel 38. And we know from what we read in Ezekiel 38 that this is describing the situation of today when Israel has come back to their land. That land has been desolate for centuries, but they've now come back. And while they are back, then these nations bound together to come to destroy Israel. And so if we just map out these countries, Magog we associate with the area around Germany and Poland. So we haven't got time, and it's not really my subject this evening in this particular type of address to look at how the tribes move, but that's where they ended up. So we associate Gog, who is the head of this confederacy of nations, is described as being of the land of Magog, and Prince of Rosh, which is the ancient name for Russia, Prince of Rosh, Meshech and Tubal, which we associate with Moscow and Tobolsky, 2 key regions of Russia. Persia is, of course, the ancient name for modern-day Iran. Ethiopia, probably more Sudan. It does incorporate the territory of northern Ethiopia, but probably more territory of Sudan today. Libya hasn't changed. Goma we associate with France over there, and Tagama with the region around Georgia and to the south Armenia. So these nations, and if we just paint in the whole of Russia, we see how Israel in the middle there is ringed by these nations, and these are the ones that are named, but it talks about with their companions and many bands with thee. So we see probably a big confederacy of nations who come down against Israel in the latter days. But it's interesting to note that all of these are non-Arab. If we just trace very briefly their genealogies, the Magog is one of the sons of Japheth. Rosh is Tiras is the original name for Rosh, which is Russia. Meshech, straightforward there. Tubal, straightforward there. Persia, the Medes and the Persians, the Madai are the Persians. And then Gomer and Togarmah. So 7 of them are sons of Japheth. In fact, all the sons of Japheth and the grandson of Japheth, with the exception of Javan. The other 2, Ethiopia and Libya, are descended from Ham. Cush is Ethiopia, and Phut is Libya. So we just put those together. We see clearly that from Shem and Japheth, from Ham, and Japheth, come all these people, but not from Shem. Shem being Israel and, of course, the Arab people. So they're non-Arab nations. But let's look a bit closer at Togarmah, because that area has been in the news. And so we're told that the house or the clan of Togarmah, Josephus tells us that the Togarmans were called by the Greeks the Phrygians. And we know that the Phrygians were the Armenians of today. But it's also interesting that the Georgians, they also claim their descent from Togarmah. If you go into their website, they claim that they are descended from Togarmah. And so Togarmah was the grandson of Gomer there. So on the map there is Armenia, which is in eastern Turkey, and Georgia is just to the north of it. So Togarmah of the North Quarters seems to indicate this region here, which of course was where all the trouble was last month. When the Georgian president took it upon himself to go into 2 parts of his country which were under Russian control. The Russians were waiting for him, and he came off the worst. But we're not interested in the actual situation, but it is the outcome from that, because that is so interesting to see. And at the time, this is from one of the Jerusalem websites, the war is a mid-sized earthquake, which indicates that the geopolitical tectonic plates are shifting. Sorry for the long words, but and the nations in the Middle East, including Israel, need to take notice. Now, why did this article say Israel's got to take notice of this big change in the Middle East situation? Well, it is that any invasion of Israel, that is the natural corridor for Russia to come down through Georgia and Armenia, through Turkey, and down into Israel. We also know from other scriptures that she comes with many ships. At the moment, her fleet is in Crimea, so one can picture a 2-pronged attack. But it is the beginning of the forward movement of Russia into the Middle East. And this website saw that what was happening in Georgia was a wake-up call for Israel. And many covers, that was The Economist, Russia Resurgent, and how the West should respond. Many pieces about the bear is back on the prowl, or the Russian bear claws Georgia, or the mouse that roared was no match for the angry bear. And there was another one showing Putin's face. Russia has crushed one neighbour, who's next? And so the nations were put on alert, and that was from the Telegraph, 1st of September, showing the Russian bear with her paw on the oil pipeline there. And in the other one, Russia has decided, because of the opposition that the West has for what she did in Georgia, she has decided to go ahead with her support of Iran to finish off the building of that nuclear power station, and also to supply Iran with these missiles, which she has been asking for years, and Russia has, because not wanting to upset the West, has stalled. But now she says, right, if that's your attitude, I'm going ahead. Again, we're not interested in the particular detail of those two areas, which are predominantly Russian-speaking areas, which Russia now occupies, and she occupies a ring around those two areas. But what is important is that going through that area are oil pipelines. Now, just to step back one step, this map rather dramatically illustrates old Europe here and new Europe, these states which in 2004 and 2007 joined the EU, who were formerly, these states were part of Russia, outer Russia. But now they have moved into the EU. And back in April time, America and NATO held a conference in Europe. They were talking about extending NATO membership to the Ukraine and to Georgia, which is just off this map here. And also talking about putting US missiles in Poland. Now, the Polish have been havering, but as soon as Russia moved into those areas of Georgia, she said to the United States, yes, put your missiles in Poland. These nations who had experienced the being under Soviet control were fearful of what they were seeing, in contrast to old Europe, who had been working, France and Germany had been working with Russia and didn't want to offend her. Now, Russia has a little area up to just to the north of Poland, Kaliningrad, and just enlarge it. That's a little tiny piece of Russia tucked into the whole area there. So what Russia said, right, if America goes ahead and puts missiles into Poland, then we'll place our missiles in Kaliningrad. We'll counter whatever you do. So we have this interesting contrast from the newer members of the EU and the older members who were on a course of appeasement. And as I say, the problem is that there is an oil pipeline that runs through Azerbaijan and through Georgia and into Turkey, which is about the only oil pipeline from these regions which doesn't go through Russia. There's a whole multitude of pipelines. This was just illustrating some new pipelines being built. There's a whole network, but they all go through Russia, and Russia has control of them. The point about this one through Georgia was it was independent of Russian control, and for the West, frightened by the control that Russia has, they are very anxious that that pipeline doesn't go into Russian hands. No doubt it will fall into their hands, but not just at the moment. There is also a gas pipeline that runs through to Turkey, again, if we just enlarge it, coming from big gas supplies of Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan. Again, that just goes through Georgia and into Turkey. And again, that is under threat. So Russian control of Georgia would truly affect the West. And it's interesting, I just slotted this in this map that came up just a week ago. The white numbers here shows the percentage of overall natural gas consumption dependent on Russian imports. And you can see how a lot of the EU countries are very dependent upon Russian gas. And this, forget this showing how Russia is growing rapidly, but these here, this is Germany. 44% of German gas is supplied by Russia and 32% of her oil. So it's quite understandable why Europe is worried about the control that Russia can wield. Just by turning off the taps, then the whole of industry will be brought low. Hence, Germany's wanting to make sure that she doesn't fall foul of Russia. So just going back to this map, what is truly remarkable, brothers and sisters, is the cooperation that we have between these countries, which were listed 2,500 years ago by Ezekiel. We just happen to be living at the time when these pieces of the jigsaw are coming together. And there is truly remarkable work between Russia and Iran. I'll say that has now been pushed forward because what Russia sees as the obstinacy of the West, and so she's increasing her aid to Iran. What Russia desperately needs are warm water ports, and she has her eye on this bit of the coastline there where there are good ports, which, if she's on the right side of Iran, she can use to tremendous advantage. Germany is a very strong supporter of Iran. She, again, has resisted United States sanctions against Iran. She supplies a lot of the equipment, machinery that is being used by Iran to make this nuclear missiles. So Germany has a very strong finger in the Iranian pie. So again, interesting, these countries which are just mentioned in this list, we see them working together. And Iran and Sudan are working together. Just in the new year, I think it was, that they formed a treaty between the two countries, a mutual defence treaty, and Iran is supplying weaponry to Sudan. So those two countries are working together, and of course Russia and Libya. Libya was under strong Soviet control. Libya, Gaddafi turns to the west, but now that is crumbling, and he is looking to Russia for arms and supplies, and indeed has offered the use of his ports for the fleets of Russia. And of course Germany and Russia, as we shall see, working together. So I say it's truly remarkable, brothers and sisters, really reassuring that these ancient prophecies, we can see why these nations are listed, because they're working together now. And when the time comes, they'll be quite happy to cooperate in coming against Israel, but we shall talk about that a bit more. So what we're seeing is the waking up of the Russian bear, and it's putting its paw prints into Georgia, and I'm sure that will develop as time goes on, putting a paw print more into Iran and into Assyria. Assyria has said to Russia, well, come and use my ports. Come and station your weaponry, your missiles in my country. I'll be more than happy. And Russia is enlarging the ports in Syria in order that instead of having her fleet all, as it were, trapped in the Black Sea and having to come through the narrow Dardanelles there, she can probably eventually move all her ships down there. And what a threat that will be to Israel. And Libya too has said, you know, use my ports as well. So we can see the paw prints beginning to move forward. A lot more to happen, but we're beginning to see it. But what is so interesting is to see the cooperation between Russia and Germany. Interesting name, Medvedev. It comes from the Russian word, the early part, the Medved, is honey eater, which is the bear. Now, in medieval times, they were more superstitious and didn't talk about bear. They used a synonym, is it? A substitute word, and called it honey eater because that's what the bears did. They ate honey. So he means honey eater, the bear, the Russian bear. Interestingly, Berlin is the capital of Germany. Now, I put this tentatively because looking at different explanations for Berlin, there was 101 different derivations, but the one that was talking about the honey eater and the bear said that in his estimation that Berlin came from the German for bear. Linn is a lake, so the Bear Lake. Just of interest that there seems to be this connection between Germany and Russia. But there's interesting reports just a month ago. Stratfor is one of those intelligence services in America who said that Russia and Germany either have already done so or are intending to sign a mutual defence pact between themselves, a security arrangement. And it's interesting what it says. Today's Germany closely resembles pre-World War II Germany. It's economically and politically strong, unified, unoccupied, which means it can actually decide whether to align with Russia or the West. Moreover, the awakening of Germany is one of the three major powers left in Europe together, the other two being France and the United Kingdom, and it has been looking to reprise its role as Europe's natural leader. It makes sense for Berlin to claim this title by dint of population, location, and economic heft. Germany and Russia are also currently each other's largest trading partners, and Russia provides more than 60% of Germany's natural gas. Germany could act like its own state and create its own security guarantee with Russia, something that would rip NATO apart. Rumours are floating around Moscow that a discussion between the Kremlin and Berlin on such a topic is occurring. Most of the world thought it was impossible for Germany and Russia to ally in the 1930s, but the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Treaty of Non-Aggression between Germany and the Soviet Union, confirmed the two countries' tradition of turning to each other when both are not at war or occupied. And this was not the first Russo-German treaty, but actually the third. There was one in 1872 and 1922, and then in the 1930s, and it said they're doing it again. Which, if that was the case, that would be what we have been expecting. The dragon and the beast working together, because they are going to cooperate together to come down against Israel. So, against that background, let's begin to fit together a sequence of events. The first event, as I say, is the Master's return for judgment. Now, there were some who would say, well, there isn't going to be a judgment seat, but scriptures are quite plain on that. 2 Corinthians 5, verse 10, we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that everyone may receive the things done in his body according to that which he hath done, whether good or bad. That's quite clear. And in Romans chapter 14 and verse 10, but why dost thou judge thy brother? For we shall all stand before the judgment seat of Christ. So then every one of us shall give account of himself to God. And there are many other references that we could go to that shows, yes, there will be a judgment seat. So the vital question is, where does that occur in relation to the Master's return? Is it before the Gogian invasion, or is it after? Well, I think the words of the Lord Jesus himself settles the matter. If we go to Revelation chapter 16, and we read the dragon, the beast, and how these were going to prepare the nations for that great battle. And then in verse 16 it says that he, and we assume it's the one in verse 15, which I've missed out at the moment, he gathers them together into a place called in the Hebrew tongue. Now the vital verse between is, behold, I come as a thief, blessed is he that watcheth and keepeth his garments, lest he walk naked and they see his shame. And we understand that this is where, in the book of Revelation, is the clear symbolism of the return of the Lord Jesus. So his return is to his household before he gathers the nations to the great battle of Armageddon. So that indicates that the judgment seat is the first thing. It is before the battle of Armageddon. And it occurs at a time when the nations will be preparing, they are preparing, but they will even more prepare to come into the land of Israel. This frog-like spirit going forth from the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet prepares them for that day. And there is a fittingness about these things, brothers and sisters. When Peter writes in 1 Peter 4, verse 17, 18, he says, the time is come that the judgment must begin at the house of God. Now, in its original context, it's talking about the events of AD 70 and the suffering that was happening to the brothers and sisters and then to the Jewish people. But I think we can quite rightly take these words, if we look at the whole context of what is saying there, that judgment must first begin at the household of God, and if it first begin at us, what shall be the end of them that obey not the gospel of God? If the righteous scarcely be saved, where shall the ungodly and sinner appear? So it seems right that the first thing is judgment upon the household. And I believe that there is a clear sequence. There are three judgments of God. There is the judgment upon the household, there is God's judgments upon Israel, and there are God's judgments upon the Gentiles. Now, we ask, where do those judgments take place? Well, I believe that the location for the judgment of the household is at Sinai. Those three passages, Deuteronomy 33, 1 to 5, and Psalm 68 and Habakkuk 3, we'll just look at Psalm 68 in a moment, are quite clear to my mind that this is the location for the judgment seat as far as the saints are concerned. God's judgment upon Israel are obviously for those Jews living in the land at the time of the invasion. That is the site of their judgments, and severe the judgments will be, as we shall see. But for those Jews who are scattered out of the land, or those Jews who are living outside the land, then the judgments are then going to proceed and take place in Europe. But as we shall see in our second part, when the Jews are gathered back to their land, they don't go direct to the land of Israel, but they get taken to Sinai. And there they enter into the new covenant in Sinai. So that is their final judgment. The rebels are purged out, we shall see. Those who accept the new covenant will then go into the land. So references there, Revelation 18 verse 4, come out of her my people, talking about the judgments upon Israel, and Ezekiel 20, which as I say we will be looking at in the second half. As far as Gentiles are concerned, well, their judgment will take place for those nations that have come into the land of Israel and exterminated Israel as a nation. Their judgment is going to take place in Israel. But then that warfare carries on and takes place in Europe. Europe is likened to a lake of fire. So Revelations chapter 17, 18 and 19 give us quite a lot of detail about God's judgments upon the Gentiles in the latter days. So just turn to Psalm 68, just this location of the judgment seat. Just diving in, as we just have to verse 17. The chariots of God are 20,000, even thousands of angels. The Lord is among them as in Sinai, in the holy place. So that's Psalm 68, verse 17. And you notice, if you've got the authorised version, a lot of those words are in italics. If we knock all those italics out, then we get left with what I've got on the screen there. The chariots of God, 20,000, thousands of angels, the Lord among them, Sinai, into the holy. Now, the authorised version, translation of that word angels, is a very bad translation. It's nothing to do, it's not the word that is used of angels, it is changed ones. The chariots of God, 20,000, thousands of changed ones, the Lord among them, RSV, from Sinai into the holy place. Now, that's can't be a reference back to the wilderness journey. They didn't go from Sinai to Jerusalem. Jerusalem didn't become the capital city till many a long year after. This is still future. This is describing a gathering of changed ones with the Lord among them, the Lord Jesus there, and going from there to save his people. going to Sinai, going to the holy place from Sinai to save his people. And Sinai is a logical place for the judgment seat to be, because this was the place where in the past Israel became a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, Exodus chapter 19. And the same thing is going to happen to saints. They're going to become kings and priests. And it is fitting that it should be at the same site. So we see a logical sequence: resurrection, call for the saints to go to judgment. Then there is an Elijah work, which again we'll look at in the second half. Invasion of Israel. Christ and the saints come to save Israel, to save the Jews, destroying the enemy in the Battle of Armageddon. Israel is saved, and then the warfare on the Gentiles. But just back to the judgment seat, just before we close this first half, how long will the judgment seat take? Well, we're not told. It is a very important event in the life of every believer. I don't believe it will be an instant matter, because this is a matter of life and death, brothers and sisters. Whether in the mercy of God we are accepted and live forever, or are rejected and are sent back to our homelands with the knowledge that we have been rejected. I believe that as well as judgment, there has to be a period of adjustment. And I draw the parallel, and I admit it's not a scriptural parallel, but it's a parallel that we can understand. When we're going from a single state to a married state, it's a big change. And we have a period that we call in the West a period of engagement, where we get to know each other, so that we are then prepared for this change from being two single people to being a married couple. And I believe that there is also necessary preparation, training, education of brothers and sisters before this dramatic change in the twinkling of an eye, when it actually takes place, the change from mortality to immortality. And I think it could well be a 10-year period while the judgment and the adjustment takes place before the change to immortality, which will just then be at the right time to go forth as the saviours of Israel. And in that case, there are several passages which talk about the situation of setting up the kingdom, likening it to the 40-year period of the Israel coming out of Egypt. If it was a 10-year period, then from Armageddon to the final establishment of the kingdom being 40 years, then that will make a 50-year, which is God's Jubilee period. And so often God has worked in Jubilees, befitting from the return of Christ to the kingdom fully extended, being a Jubilee period. The Book of Analysis is a wonderful little booklet. You can download it off the internet if you haven't got a copy, but to read what Brother Thomas said so long ago about the judgment seat and the steps to this change, fascinating little booklet. But just finally, two questions often arise. How are we going to be called, and what will happen to our children? Well, just turn to John chapter 11. It's the situation of Lazarus. And in verse 28, Martha had been to Jesus, and Martha then, when she had so said, she went her way and called Mary her sister secretly, saying, "The Master is come and calleth for thee." Now, I admit, I can't use this as definite evidence, but and especially in the context of the raising of Lazarus and resurrection, it seems a preeminently wonderful way of doing things. obviously, Martha and Mary were both alive, but I think if somebody came from the dead, just a few weeks ago buried Brother Bill Grace, if on a Sunday morning Bill Grace walked through the doors of our meeting room, we would know beyond a shadow of doubt that the Lord had come back because we buried him. Father came back. So I think that could well be the way that we know that the Lord Jesus has come back. Won't be dramatic signs, visible signs. It will be, in quiet word, the Master calleth for thee. How we get to Sinai, we do not know. God will look after those events. But what about our children? Well, surely like in the Exodus, our children will go with us, with their parents. And if the judgment seat does occupy a period of, say, 10 years, then even if it's just a newborn baby, then by the time the separation for the parents, they've got a work to do as immortal beings, that child will be 9 or 10, old enough to be cared for by the angels and to be cared for by Jews, bring them up, educate them. Just turn to, and this is our last reference for this part, Isaiah chapter 56. A lovely little phrase in this chapter which speaks of the kingdom age. Verse 6, also the sons of strangers that join themselves to the Lord to serve him and to love the name of the Lord, to be his servants, every one that keepeth the Sabbath from polluting it and taketh hold of my covenant, even them will I bring to mine holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices shall be accepted upon mine altar, and my house shall be called a house of prayer for all people. So there is a reference, brothers and sisters, about these strangers being brought to Israel, to become part of Israel, to be adopted into a Jewish tribe. And our children then will have their opportunity during the millennium. They will be able to walk in faith, in the hope of a resurrection at the end of the millennium and everlasting life at the end of the kingdom. So don't worry. The Lord will take care of our children. He will give them this wonderful opportunity to embrace the truth in the land of Israel, in the kingdom itself. So I admit my two titles, Gathering the Nations to Armageddon and Armageddon After, I knew I wouldn't be able to get there. We'll break here.